You walk into a room you have never entered before, and something happens. A feeling. Not a thought, a feeling. A sudden, overwhelming, physiologically unmistakable sensation that you have been here before. Not a room like this one. This exact room. This exact moment. The light falling at this exact angle through this exact window. The conversation unfolding in this exact sequence with these exact words. You know what will happen next, not because you have reasoned it out, but because you have already experienced it. You have already been here. You have already lived this moment. You are living it again. And then it is gone. The feeling dissolves as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind only the memory of the feeling and a lingering, disorienting sense that something extraordinary just happened, something that your rational mind cannot explain and that the English language does not have a word for. So you use the French déjà vu, already seen. Déjà vu is one of the most common, most universal, and most poorly understood experiences in human consciousness. Surveys consistently show that between 60 and 97% of people have experienced it at least once. It occurs across every culture, every age group, every socioeconomic class, and every level of education. It is reported by children as young as 6 and by adults well into their 90s. It is not a symptom of disease. It is not a sign of psychological disturbance. It is not a cultural artifact or a linguistic construct. It is a genuine, physiologically real, phenomenologically distinct experience that the human brain produces spontaneously, unpredictably, and without any known trigger, an experience that has resisted every attempt at complete scientific explanation for over a century and a half. The term déjà vu was coined in 1876 by the French philosopher Émile Boirac, who described it as the strange, troubling, and at times profoundly disturbing sensation of having already experienced the present moment. Boirac recognized that the experience was not a memory in the ordinary sense, not a recollection of a specific past event that matches the present situation. It was something else. A feeling of familiarity without a source, a recognition without a referent, a sense of alreadiness that attaches itself to the present moment without pointing to any specific past moment that could account for it. This is the core mystery of déjà vu. The familiarity is real, but the memory is missing. The brain generates a powerful, unmistakable signal of recognition, the signal that ordinarily accompanies the retrieval of a genuine memory, but there is no memory to retrieve. The signal fires without a target. The recognition occurs without an object. And the conscious mind, receiving a recognition signal with no corresponding memory, produces the disorienting, almost metaphysical experience that we call déjà vu. The feeling that you have lived this moment before, combined with the knowledge that you have not. The neuroscience of déjà vu begins with the brain's memory system specifically, with a distinction between two types of memory that the brain processes through two different neural circuits. The first type is recollection, the explicit, detailed, context-rich retrieval of a specific past event. When you remember your 10th birthday party, you recollect. You recall specific details, the cake, the candles, the faces of the guests, the present you wanted, the one you got. The recollection is vivid, specific, and tied to a particular time and place. It is processed primarily by the hippocampus, the seahorse-shaped structure in the medial temporal lobe that is responsible for encoding and retrieving episodic memories. The second type is familiarity, the diffuse, contextless, detail-free sense that something has been encountered before without any specific memory of when, where, or how. When you see a face on the street and know that you have seen it before but cannot remember where or when, you are experiencing familiarity without recollection. The face is familiar, but the memory is absent. The recognition signal fires, but no specific episode is retrieved. Familiarity is processed primarily by the perirhinal cortex, and the entorhinal cortex structures in the medial temporal lobe that are adjacent to the hippocampus, but that operate through different neural mechanisms. The dual process theory of memory, developed by the psychologists Andrew Ioannidis and Maurice Moscovich, proposes that recollection and familiarity are independent processes that can be activated separately. You can have recollection without familiarity when you remember a specific event, but it does not feel familiar, as sometimes happens with very old or very unusual memories. And you can have familiarity without recollection when something feels familiar, but you cannot recall the specific encounter that produced the familiarity. This second dissociation, familiarity without recollection, is the neurological basis of déjà vu. The dissociation between familiarity and recollection has been confirmed by lesion studies, neuroimaging studies, and pharmacological studies. Patients with selective damage to the hippocampus lose the ability to recollect specific episodes, but retain the ability to experience familiarity. Patients with selective damage to the perirhinal cortex lose the ability to experience familiarity, but retain the ability to recollect. And the drug midazolam, which selectively impairs hippocampal function, produces a state in which subjects can experience familiarity for stimuli they have been exposed to, but cannot recollect the specific exposure. The two systems are genuinely independent, anatomically distinct, functionally separable, and capable of operating without each other. The independence of the two systems means that the familiarity signal can fire without the recollection signal. The perirhinal cortex can say, "Yes, this is familiar," while the hippocampus says, "I have no record of this." And when this dissociation occurs in everyday life, when the familiarity system fires without the recollection system confirming it, the conscious mind experiences déjà vu. Déjà vu is, in the dual process framework, a misfiring of the familiarity system. The perirhinal cortex generates a familiarity signal, the signal that says, "This has been encountered before," without the hippocampus generating a corresponding recollection. The familiarity is real. It is a genuine neural signal produced by genuine neural activity in the perirhinal cortex. But it is often disconnected from any specific memory, floating free of any episodic context, and experienced by the conscious mind as a recognition without a source. The psychologist Anne Cleary at Colorado State University has conducted the most systematic experimental research on déjà vu. Cleary's research program, spanning over a decade, has produced a series of findings that have transformed our understanding of the phenomenon. Cleary's most important finding is that déjà vu can be triggered in the laboratory by presenting subjects with scenes that are spatially similar to previously studied scenes, but that differ in their specific content. In Cleary's paradigm, subjects first study a series of scenes, a living room, a garden, a street corner, and then are shown a new set of scenes, some of which share the spatial layout of the studied scenes, but contain entirely different objects, colours, and details. The subjects frequently report déjà vu for the new scenes that share the spatial layout of the studied scenes, even though the scenes are visually different. Even though the subjects cannot identify which studied scene matches the layout, and even though the subjects explicitly deny having seen the new scene before, this finding is crucial. It demonstrates that déjà vu is not a random malfunction. It is a systematic, predictable, experimentally controllable response to a specific type of stimulus. A stimulus that matches the structural pattern of a previously encountered stimulus without matching its specific content. The brain detects the structural match, the shared spatial layout, the shared relational pattern, the shared gestalt, and generates a familiarity signal. But the brain cannot identify the source of the match because the specific content is different. The familiarity signal fires, the recollection system fails, and the result is déjà vu. Cleary calls this Gestalt familiarity, the familiarity that arises from the match of overall structure rather than specific details. The brain is recognizing the pattern, not the content. The room feels familiar not because you have been in this specific room before, but because the spatial arrangement of this room matches the spatial arrangement of another room that you have been in. The moment feels familiar, not because you have lived this specific moment before, but because the relational structure of this moment, the pattern of events, the sequence of actions, the configuration of sensory input matches the relational structure of another moment that the brain has encoded. Cleary has also demonstrated that déjà vu can be triggered by auditory stimuli, by musical passages that share the melodic contour of previously heard passages, but that differ in their specific notes, tempo, and instrumentation. The brain detects the structural match between the melodic contours and generates a familiarity signal, even though the specific musical content is entirely different. The finding extends the Gestalt familiarity hypothesis from the visual to the auditory domain, suggesting that déjà vu is a multimodal phenomenon that operates on structural patterns regardless of the sensory channel through which the patterns are perceived. Cleary has further shown that the intensity of the déjà vu experience correlates with the degree of structural match between the current stimulus and the stored pattern. Higher structural similarity produces stronger déjà vu, and the correlation is continuous. There is no threshold below which the structural match fails to produce any familiarity, and above which it suddenly produces full déjà vu. Instead, the familiarity increases gradually with the degree of match, suggesting that déjà vu is not a binary on-off experience, but a graded phenomenon that ranges from mild, barely perceptible familiarity to the intense, overwhelming, almost hallucinatory recognition that characterizes the strongest déjà vu episodes. Cleary's subsequent research has extended this finding in several directions. She has shown that déjà vu is accompanied by a strong feeling of knowing what will happen next, a feeling of precognition, of having access to the future of the current moment. Subjects who report déjà vu also report that they feel they know what the next event in the sequence will be, even though, when tested, their predictions are no more accurate than chance. The feeling of precognition is real as an experience, but it is not accurate as a prediction. The brain is generating a prediction signal along with the familiarity signal, but the prediction is based on the structural match with the past, not on any genuine access to the future. Or is it? This is where the neuroscience reaches its limit and the deeper questions begin. Because Cleary's finding that déjà vu is accompanied by a feeling of precognition raises a question that the neuroscience cannot fully answer. Why does the brain generate a precognition signal during déjà vu? The Gestalt familiarity hypothesis explains the familiarity signal the brain is detecting a structural match with a past experience. But why does the structural match produce a feeling of knowing the future? Why does the recognition of a past pattern generate the sense that you already know what will happen next? The standard neuroscientific answer is that the precognition feeling is an artifact, a byproduct of the familiarity signal that the brain misinterprets as a signal about the future. The brain detects a match with the past, generates a familiarity signal, and the conscious mind, unable to locate the source of the familiarity in a specific past event, attributes it to the future instead. The reasoning is, this feels familiar, but I haven't been here before, therefore I must have experienced this in the future. I must be remembering something that hasn't happened yet. The precognition is an inference, not a perception. This explanation is plausible, but it is not the only explanation, and the data do not compel it. The neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield provided the first direct neural evidence for déjà vu in the 1950s. Penfield, working at the Montreal Neurological Institute, was performing brain surgery on epilepsy patients who were awake during the procedure, their skulls open, their brains exposed. their consciousness intact. Penfield used a small electrical probe to stimulate specific points on the brain's surface, mapping the functions of different regions by observing what the stimulation produced. When Penfield stimulated points in the temporal lobe, specifically in the region where the hippocampus meets the entorhinal and perirhinal cortices, the patients reported vivid, intense, unmistakable déjà vu experiences. They felt that they had lived the present moment before. They felt that they knew what would happen next. And some patients reported that the déjà vu was accompanied by a vivid, dreamlike scene that they could not identify as a specific memory, but that felt more real, more immediate, and more present than an ordinary memory. Penfield's discovery established that déjà vu is a temporal lobe phenomenon, that it is generated by the same brain regions that process memory, that it can be triggered by the electrical activation of specific neural circuits, and that it is associated with a specific, identifiable pattern of neural activity. But Penfield's finding also raised a question that he could not answer. What is the brain doing when it generates déjà vu spontaneously? The electrical stimulation mimics a natural process. But what is the natural process? What triggers the spontaneous activation of the déjà vu circuit in the absence of an external probe? Penfield's findings have been replicated and extended by modern neurosurgery. The neurosurgeon Jean Boncode and colleagues, working at the Sainte-Anne Hospital in Paris, mapped the déjà vu circuit with unprecedented precision using depth electrodes, thin electrodes inserted directly into the brain tissue, capable of stimulating and recording from specific structures deep within the temporal lobe. Boncode showed that déjà vu is most reliably triggered by stimulation of the entorhinal cortex, the gateway between the hippocampus and the neocortex, the structure that processes the transformation of sensory input into memory traces. The entorhinal cortex is the bottleneck through which all incoming information must pass on its way to the hippocampus. And the stimulation of this bottleneck, the artificial activation of the gateway, produces the sensation that the incoming information has already been processed, already been encoded, already been experienced. The modern neuroscientist Fabrice Bartolomei at Aix-Marseille University has used intracranial EEG to record the precise neural activity patterns that accompany spontaneous déjà vu in epilepsy patients. Bartolomei found that déjà vu is associated with a specific pattern of neural synchronization between the entorhinal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala, a brief, intense, a highly coherent burst of gamma frequency oscillation that spreads through the medial temporal lobe circuit in a pattern that resembles, but is not identical to, the pattern produced by genuine memory retrieval. The déjà vu circuit is not identical to the memory circuit. It is a variant, a modified version of the memory retrieval pattern that produces the subjective experience of recognition without the objective content of a specific memory. The epilepsy connection provides an important clue. Déjà vu is one of the most common auras reported by patients with temporal lobe epilepsy, the type of epilepsy that originates in the medial temporal lobe, in the same region that Penfield stimulated. Approximately 80% of temporal lobe epilepsy patients report déjà vu as a pre-seizure aura, a brief, intense experience that occurs seconds before the seizure begins. The déjà vu aura is triggered by the abnormal electrical activity that precedes the seizure, by the spreading wave of neural excitation that propagates through the temporal lobe and that activates the déjà vu circuit in the same way that Penfield's probe activated it. But here is the critical observation. The déjà vu experienced by epilepsy patients is phenomenologically identical to the déjà vu experienced by healthy people. The sensation is the same. The feeling of familiarity is the same. The feeling of precognition is the same. And the disorienting, almost metaphysical quality of the experience is the same. The only difference is the trigger. In epilepsy patients, the trigger is abnormal electrical activity. In healthy people, the trigger is unknown. The neuroscientist Akira O'Connor at the University of St Andrews has used functional MRI to study déjà vu in healthy subjects. O'Connor's method involves inducing a déjà vu-like experience by presenting subjects with a list of related words: bed, rest, awake, tired, dream, blanket, doze, slumber, snore, and then asking them whether the word sleep was on the list. The word sleep was not on the list, but the related words create a strong, false sense of familiarity for sleep, the DRM paradigm, named after its developers Deese, Rodiger, and McDermott. When subjects report the sense that sleep was on the list while simultaneously knowing that it was not, the resulting conflict between familiarity and knowledge produces a subjective experience that closely resembles déjà vu. O'Connor's fMRI results revealed something unexpected. During the déjà vu-like experience, the brain regions that showed the most activity were not the memory regions of the medial temporal lobe. They were the prefrontal regions, the regions associated with conflict monitoring, decision-making, and the evaluation of memory accuracy. The prefrontal cortex was activated because the brain was detecting a conflict. The familiarity signal said, "Yes, this is familiar," while the recollection system said, "No, this was not on the list." The déjà vu experience was, in O'Connor's analysis, the conscious manifestation of this conflict, the brain's recognition that the familiarity signal and the recollection system were giving contradictory answers, and the resulting disorientation that this contradiction produces. O'Connor described déjà vu as a fact-checking mechanism, the brain's way of flagging a discrepancy between what the familiarity system says and what the recollection system says. The déjà vu is not a malfunction. It is a function, a quality control process that alerts the conscious mind to a mismatch between two memory systems that should normally agree. The experience feels strange and disorienting because it is the conscious perception of a neural conflict that normally occurs below the threshold of awareness. O'Connor's finding challenges the common assumption that déjà vu is a memory phenomenon. In O'Connor's data, déjà vu activates the executive control regions, not the memory regions. The brain is not retrieving a memory during déjà vu. It is evaluating a memory claim, assessing whether the familiarity signal is accurate, and concluding that it is not. Déjà vu is, in this view, the brain catching itself in an error, detecting a false positive from the familiarity system and flagging it for conscious review. This account is supported by the demographic data on déjà vu. The experience is most common in young adults, peaking between ages 15 and 25 and declining steadily thereafter. This age profile does not match the profile of memory disorders, which increase with age. It matches the profile of the prefrontal cortex's development. The prefrontal cortex reaches full maturity in the mid-20s, and the peak of déjà vu frequency coincides with the peak of prefrontal conflict monitoring capacity. Young adults experience more déjà vu, not because their memories are more disordered, but because their conflict monitoring systems are more active, more sensitive, and more likely to detect and flag the discrepancy between familiarity and recollection. This is an elegant account, but it raises more questions than it answers. If déjà vu is merely a fact-checking mechanism, why does it feel so profound? Why does it carry the overwhelming sense that something metaphysically significant is happening? Why does it produce the feeling of precognition, the sensation that you know what will happen next? And why does it leave in its wake a lingering sense of wonder, of mystery, of having glimpsed something about the nature of time and reality that the ordinary mind does not normally perceive? The neuroscience can describe the mechanism. The temporal lobe generates a familiarity signal. The hippocampus fails to provide a matching recollection. The prefrontal cortex detects the conflict. and the conscious mind experiences the conflict as déjà vu. But the neuroscience cannot explain the phenomenology, the specific qualitative experiential character of the déjà vu experience, which includes elements that the conflict monitoring account does not predict. The feeling of temporal displacement, the feeling of precognition, the feeling of having access to a deeper layer of reality than the one that ordinary consciousness inhabits. The psychologist Vernon Nepi, who has studied déjà vu for over 4 decades, has documented a taxonomy of déjà vu subtypes that extends far beyond the simple familiarity without recollection model. Nepi identifies déjà vu already lived, the full body sensation of having experienced the present moment in its entirety. Déjà senti already felt, the emotional recognition without perceptual familiarity. Déjà visité already visited, the spatial familiarity with a place one has never been. And déjà rêvé, already dreamed, the recognition that the current experience matches a dream one has had, sometimes years earlier. Each subtype suggests a different mechanism and a different source. Déjà vécu, the most intense and the most commonly reported subtype, is a full, immersive, multi-sensory recognition of the entire current moment, not merely a visual recognition, but a bodily recognition, an emotional recognition, a temporal recognition. The experiencer does not merely see the familiar scene, they feel themselves inside it, feel the specific emotional state, the specific bodily posture, the specific quality of attention that they associate with having lived this moment before. Déjà visité is particularly intriguing, the uncanny familiarity with a place one has never visited, reported by travelers who arrive in a foreign city and recognize specific streets, specific buildings, specific views that they have never encountered in waking life. Nathaniel Hawthorne reported a vivid déjà visité experience upon visiting an English castle for the first time, later discovering that an ancestor had lived there centuries earlier. The variety of subtypes suggests that déjà vu is not a single phenomenon with a single cause. It is a family of experiences that share the common feature of recognition without a known source, but that differ in their sensory modality, their emotional quality, their temporal character, and their relationship to specific past experiences. A single neurological mechanism, the misfiring of the familiarity system, may account for the simplest cases. But the more complex subtypes, especially déjà visité and déjà rêvé, suggest sources of recognition that extend beyond the familiarity recollection framework. Déjà rêvé is particularly significant for our investigation. A substantial minority of déjà vu experiencers report that the moment they are recognizing is not merely familiar, it is a moment they have dreamed. They report specific dreams, sometimes dreamed weeks or months or years before the déjà vu event, that match the current moment in specific detail. The dream contained this room, this conversation, this exact sequence of events. And the déjà vu is the moment of recognition, the moment when the dreamed experience and the waking experience converge, and the conscious mind recognizes that it has encountered this moment before, not in waking life, but in a dream. The neuroscience cannot easily accommodate déjà rêvé. If déjà vu is merely a misfiring of the familiarity system, why would the familiarity sometimes match a specific dream? If the familiarity signal is contentless, a mere "this is familiar" flag, without any specific referent, why would the experiencer be able to identify a specific dream that matches the current moment? The dream matching cannot be explained by Gestalt familiarity, because the match is not structural but specific. Not, "this room has the same layout as another room," but "I dreamed this exact room, with this exact person, saying these exact words." The phenomenon of déjà rêvé connects to our previous investigation of dreams and quantum timelines, where we explored the possibility that dreams may provide access to information that extends beyond the boundaries of the present moment. If dreams can access quantum information from other branches of the wave function, from other possible configurations of the block universe, then déjà rêvé is the waking recognition of a dream that accessed the future. A dream that perceived, through the quantum correlations of the sleeping brain, the specific moment that the waking brain is now experiencing. The contemplative traditions have never regarded déjà vu as a malfunction. They have regarded it as a perception, a brief, spontaneous, usually involuntary perception of a deeper layer of reality that the ordinary waking mind does not normally access. In Buddhism, the concept of pubbe-nivasanussati, the recollection of past lives, is one of the 3 higher knowledges that the Buddha attained on the night of his enlightenment. The ability to recall previous existences is not regarded as supernatural or miraculous in the Buddhist framework. It is a natural faculty of consciousness that is normally obscured by the delusions of the untrained mind, but that can be recovered through the systematic training of meditation. Déjà vu, in this framework, is a spontaneous, partial, involuntary activation of the pubbe-nivasanussati faculty, a brief glimpse of a memory that extends beyond the current life, a flash of recognition from a consciousness that has experienced many lives, and that occasionally, without warning, recognizes a moment from one of them. The Jataka tales, the canonical stories of the Buddha's previous lives, describe numerous instances in which the Buddha recognizes people, places, and situations from previous existences. The recognition is phenomenologically identical to déjà vu, a sudden, overwhelming sense of familiarity that arises without warning, and that points to a source that cannot be located in the current life's memory. The Buddhist tradition does not ask whether déjà vu is a memory or a malfunction. It answers, it is a memory from a life that the current personality does not remember, but that the deeper consciousness has never forgotten. In Christianity, the mystical tradition describes experiences of foreknowledge, the sudden, unbidden perception of events before they occur that are structurally identical to déjà vu. The Desert Father Evagrius Ponticus, in the 4th century, described the experience of spiritual prescience, the awareness of events before they unfold, arising spontaneously during prayer or meditation. Evagrius attributed the experience to the soul's natural capacity for perceiving the divine order, the logos that structures reality and that the soul, in its deepest nature, participates in. The déjà vu is the moment when the soul's participation in the divine order becomes briefly conscious. The moment when the veil between the temporal and the eternal thins enough for the soul to perceive, however briefly, the timeless order that the Logos has already established. In Islam, the concept of firasat, spiritual insight, intuitive perception, describes the believer's capacity for perceiving truths that are hidden from ordinary awareness. The Prophet Muhammad is reported to have said, "Beware the firasat of the believer, for indeed he sees with the light of God." The firasat is not a rational deduction. It is a direct perception, a seeing with a faculty that transcends the ordinary senses and that accesses information that the ordinary mind cannot reach. Déjà vu, in the Islamic framework, is a spontaneous activation of the firasat, a moment in which the believer's consciousness briefly accesses the light of God, perceiving the divine order that structures reality and recognizing, in the current moment, a pattern that the divine light has already illuminated. In Hinduism, the concept of samskaras, the impressions left on consciousness by past actions and past experiences, including those from previous lives, provides the most explicit framework for understanding déjà vu as a genuine memory. The samskaras are stored in the chitta, the storehouse of consciousness, the repository of all impressions from all lifetimes. They are normally inaccessible to the ordinary waking mind, but they can surface spontaneously, without warning, when the current experience resonates with a stored samskara, when the vibrational pattern of the present moment matches the vibrational pattern of a past impression. Déjà vu is the surfacing of a samskara, the moment when a stored impression from a previous experience, possibly a previous life, resonates with the current moment and produces the sensation of recognition that the conscious mind cannot account for. The neuroscience says déjà vu is a familiarity signal without a source. The traditions say the source exists. It is merely beyond the reach of ordinary memory. The neuroscience says the precognition feeling is an artifact. The traditions say the precognition is a perception of the order that structures reality across time. The neuroscience says déjà vu is a glitch. The traditions say déjà vu is a glimpse. In the next stage, we will explore the quantum mechanical frameworks that could bridge these two accounts, the many worlds interpretation, the block universe, the retrocausality hypothesis, and the Penrose-Hameroff model of quantum consciousness, and ask whether déjà vu might be, as the traditions suggest, a genuine perception of a deeper reality that the neuroscience has not yet learned to measure. We have established that the neuroscience of déjà vu can explain the mechanism, the misfiring of the familiarity system, the dissociation between perirhinal familiarity and hippocampal recollection, the conflict monitoring response of the prefrontal cortex. But we have also established that the neuroscience cannot fully explain the phenomenology, the feeling of temporal displacement, the feeling of precognition, the feeling of having access to deeper layer of reality, and the specific phenomenon of déjà rêvé, in which the current moment matches a specific dream from the past. Now we must ask whether quantum mechanics offers frameworks that can account for the features of déjà vu that the neuroscience leaves unexplained. And the answer is that quantum mechanics offers not one but 4 frameworks, each of which provides a specific, physically precise mechanism by which consciousness could access information from beyond the boundaries of the present moment, and each of which, if correct, would transform déjà vu from a neural glitch into a genuine perception of the deeper structure of time. The first framework is the block universe. In our investigation of time at the beginning of this series, we established that general relativity describes time as a dimension of spacetime, that past, present, and future are not separate categories of existence, but coexisting regions of a 4-dimensional block that is complete, unchanging, and eternal. The block universe does not flow, it simply is. The past exists, the future exists, and the present, the moment you are experiencing right now, is not a special, ontologically privileged instant that moves through the block. It is a specific location in the block, no more and no less real than any other location. If the block universe is the correct picture of time, then the future already exists. It is there, in the block, fully formed, fully determined, waiting to be experienced by the consciousness that traverses it. And the question of whether consciousness can access the future becomes a question about the mechanism of traversal. How does consciousness move through the block? Is the traversal strictly sequential, one moment after another, with no access to moments that the consciousness has not yet reached? Or can the traversal be non-sequential with occasional, brief, involuntary excursions to future moments that the consciousness has not yet reached in its normal sequential progression? Déjà vu, in the block universe framework, is a non-sequential excursion. The consciousness briefly accesses a future moment in the block, a moment that it will reach later in its sequential traversal, but that it perceives now, out of sequence, through a mechanism that the block universe permits but that the sequential traversal normally prevents. The déjà vu is not a memory of the past. It is a memory of the future, a memory that the consciousness formed during a brief, involuntary excursion to a future location in the block, and that it recognizes when it arrives at that location through the normal sequential progression. The block universe framework explains why déjà vu feels the way it does. The feeling of temporal displacement, the sense that you have been transported to another time, is the conscious perception of a non-sequential location in the block. The feeling of precognition, the sense that you know what will happen next, is the residual trace of the future moment that the consciousness has already visited. And the feeling of uncanniness, the disorienting, almost metaphysical quality of the experience, is the cognitive dissonance between the sequential traversal that the conscious mind expects and the non-sequential access that the excursion provides. The physicist Julian Barbour, in his book The End of Time, has argued that time does not exist at all, that the block universe is a collection of nows, each one a complete, self-contained configuration of the universe, and that the appearance of temporal flow is produced by the correlations between the nows rather than by any actual flow from one to the next. In Barbour's timeless physics, déjà vu is the momentary perception of the timeless structure, the flash of insight in which consciousness perceives, briefly, that the flow of time is an illusion, and that all moments exist simultaneously in the block. The déjà vu is not an error in the timing mechanism. It is a glimpse of the truth about time, the truth that time does not flow, and that every moment is eternally present. The philosopher J.M.E. McTaggart, in his famous 1908 paper, The Unreality of Time, argued on purely logical grounds that temporal flow is self-contradictory and that the true nature of reality is timeless. McTaggart's argument has been debated for over a century, but the block universe of general relativity provides exactly the physical framework that McTaggart's argument requires. A reality in which all moments exist simultaneously, and in which the appearance of flow is produced by the perspective of a consciousness embedded in the block. Déjà vu is the moment when McTaggart's philosophical truth and Barbour's physical truth become experientially available to the ordinary consciousness that normally perceives only the sequential flow. The mechanism of the non-sequential excursion is not specified by the block universe itself. The block universe describes the structure of time, but not the mechanism by which consciousness traverses it. But the other three frameworks provide specific mechanisms for non-sequential access to the block mechanisms that are grounded in the physics of quantum mechanics and that make specific, testable predictions about when and how the excursion should occur. The second framework is the many worlds interpretation. The many worlds interpretation, proposed by Hugh Everett in 1957, holds that every quantum measurement causes the universe to split into multiple branches, each branch containing a different outcome of the measurement. The electron that could be spin up or spin down produces two branches, one in which the electron is spin up and one in which the electron is spin down. Both branches are real, both continue to exist, and both contain conscious observers who experience their branch as the only reality. The many worlds interpretation is not fringe physics. It is endorsed by a significant and growing number of physicists, including Sean Carroll, David Wallace, and Max Tegmark, and it is arguably the most natural interpretation of the equations of quantum mechanics. The interpretation that takes the mathematics at face value without adding the collapse postulate that the Copenhagen interpretation requires. The wave function never collapses in the many worlds interpretation. It evolves, splits and branches, but it never reduces, and the result is a vast, ever-expanding tree of branches, each one containing a complete, self-consistent, fully real version of the universe. In the many worlds interpretation, every possible history of the universe is being played out simultaneously in different branches of the universal wave function. Every possible sequence of events, every possible life trajectory, every possible version of this moment is occurring right now in some branch. And the total wave function, the quantum state of the entire universe, contains all branches superposed, entangled, and evolving according to the Schrödinger equation. The branches are normally isolated from each other. The decoherence that separates the branches is extraordinarily effective. Once two branches have decoherent, the quantum interference between them becomes vanishingly small, and no information can pass from one branch to another. The isolation is not absolute. The branches are still part of the same universal wave function, and the interference between them is not zero, but merely undetectably small. But the isolation is, for all practical purposes, complete. For all practical purposes, but not for all possible purposes. The physicist David Deutsch, one of the founders of quantum computation, has argued that the many worlds interpretation does not prohibit interbranch communication. It merely makes it extraordinarily difficult. The interference between branches is not zero. It is incredibly small, and the question of whether any physical system could detect this incredibly small interference could perceive, however faintly, the quantum echoes of other branches is a question that the physics has not definitively answered. Déjà vu, in the many worlds framework, is the detection of interbranch interference. The consciousness in this branch perceives, briefly and involuntarily, a quantum echo from another branch, a branch in which the current moment has already occurred, a branch in which the sequence of events that you are now experiencing has already played out. The echo is faint. It is fleeting. It does not contain specific, detailed information about the other branch, but it contains enough information to produce the sensation of familiarity, the feeling that this moment has already happened, the feeling that you have already been here, the feeling of déjà vu. The physicist Max Tegmark has argued that the many worlds interpretation implies that every possible version of you exists in some branch of the wave function. There is a branch in which you turned left instead of right, a branch in which you said yes instead of no, a branch in which you are reading these words, and a branch in which you never encountered them. The total you, the quantum you, the you that exists in the universal wave function is not a single person, but a vast, branching, ever-multiplying ensemble of persons, each one experiencing their own branch as the only reality. If the branches are not perfectly isolated, if the decoherence that separates them is not absolutely complete, then the quantum you may occasionally perceive traces of other branches. The perception would be faint, fleeting, and difficult to distinguish from imagination or memory error. It would feel like a vague sense that this moment has happened before, that this conversation has been had, that this scene has been experienced because, in another branch, it has. The déjà vu is not a false memory. It is a true memory, a memory from another branch of the wave function, leaking through the imperfect decoherence barrier that separates the branches and reaching your consciousness as a faint, unmistakable, phenomenologically distinctive signal of recognition. The many worlds framework makes a specific prediction about déjà vu. The experience should be more likely to occur at moments of quantum indeterminacy, moments when the brain is in a superposition of states, when the quantum branches are closely spaced, and when the interference between branches is at its maximum. These moments would be moments of decision, of uncertainty, of the brain computing multiple possibilities simultaneously before collapsing into a specific outcome. And the empirical data is consistent with this prediction. Déjà vu is more common during states of fatigue, stress, and cognitive overload states in which the brain's decision-making processes are operating at the edge of their capacity, and in which quantum indeterminacy might play a more significant role in neural computation. The third framework is retrocausality. In our investigation of the future self, we examined the evidence for retrocausal influences in quantum mechanics, influences in which the future affects the past. The Wheeler delayed choice experiment demonstrates that a measurement performed today can determine the properties of a photon that was emitted billions of years ago. The Aharonov-Bergman-Lebovitz formalism, the two-state vector formalism, describes quantum systems as being determined by both their past and their future boundary conditions. And the transactional interpretation of quantum mechanics, developed by John Cramer, describes quantum events as the product of a handshake between a wave traveling forward in time and a wave traveling backward in time. The physicist Hugh Price at the University of Cambridge has argued that retrocausality is not merely permitted by physics, but is required by the time symmetry of the fundamental laws. The laws of physics are symmetric under time reversal. They work equally well forward and backward in time. If the past can influence the future, and the laws are time symmetric, then the future must be able to influence the past. The asymmetry of causation, the assumption that causes always precede effects, is not a law of physics. It is a prejudice born of our experience as macroscopic beings embedded in a thermodynamic arrow of time, and it is violated at the quantum level by the same laws that produce entanglement, superposition, and the other quantum phenomena that the macroscopic world conceals. Price's argument gives retrocausality a firmer philosophical foundation than it is usually granted. The retrocausal influence is not exotic. It is natural, a straightforward consequence of the time symmetry of the laws of physics, operating at the quantum level where the thermodynamic arrow of time does not apply, and the conscious perception of retrocausal influences, if such perception is possible, would be the perception of a fundamental symmetry of physical law that the macroscopic world normally conceals. If retrocausal influences are genuine, if the future really does affect the past through the quantum mechanical mechanisms that these frameworks describe, then déjà vu may be the conscious perception of a retrocausal influence. The future moment, the moment you are about to experience, sends a quantum signal backward in time. The signal arrives at an earlier moment, perhaps a dream, perhaps a waking moment of distraction or reverie, perhaps the moment immediately before the déjà vu occurs. The earlier moment registers the signal as a vague impression, a sense of familiarity, a dream that contains the specific details of the future moment. And when the future moment arrives in the normal sequential progression of consciousness, the earlier impression is recognized, and the recognition is experienced as déjà vu. The retrocausal framework provides a specific mechanism for déjà rêvé, the subtype of déjà vu in which the current moment matches a specific dream. The dream is the earlier moment at which the retrocausal signal arrived. The signal from the future moment carried by the backward traveling quantum wave reached the dreaming brain, which was in a state of reduced decoherence and heightened quantum sensitivity, and encoded the signal as a dream. The dream contained the specific details of the future moment because the retrocausal signal contained those details. And the déjà vu is the moment of recognition, the moment when the forward-traveling consciousness reaches the moment that the backward-traveling signal had already previewed. The physicist Yakir Aharonov, one of the developers of the two-state vector formalism, has argued that retrocausal influences are not merely permitted by quantum mechanics, they are required. The two-state vector formalism describes every quantum event as determined by two boundary conditions: the initial condition, the preparation of the system in the past, and the final condition, the measurement of the system in the future. Both boundary conditions are necessary to determine the system's behavior, and the influence of the final condition on the system's behavior between the boundaries is a genuine, physical, retrocausal influence that propagates backward in time from the future measurement to the present state. Aharonov has described the retrocausal influence as the future reaching back to shape the present. In the déjà vu framework, the future moment is reaching back to the present moment, or to the dream that preceded it, and shaping the present consciousness's perception so that it contains a preview of what is to come. The preview is not detailed enough to constitute a genuine prophecy. It is a vague impression, a sense of familiarity, a feeling that something significant is about to happen. But it is real, a genuine retrocausal influence carried by the quantum mechanical, backward-traveling wave. The experimental evidence for retrocausal influences in quantum mechanics, while controversial, is growing. The physicist Darrell Bem at Cornell University published a landmark study in 2011 Inches, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, showing that subjects' responses to stimuli were influenced by events that had not yet occurred at the time of the response. Bem's results have been partially replicated by some groups and have failed to replicate in others, producing a contentious debate that has not been resolved. But the debate itself is significant. The experimental claim that the future can influence the present is not dismissed as pseudoscience. It is debated as a serious empirical question by serious scientists in peer-reviewed journals. The physicist Dean Radin at the Institute of Noetic Sciences has conducted a series of experiments on presentiment, the physiological anticipation of future events before they occur. Radin's experiments measure skin conductance, heart rate, and pupil dilation in subjects who are about to be shown randomly selected images, some emotionally neutral, some emotionally arousing. Radin has consistently found that the physiological responses begin before the image is shown, that the body begins to react to the emotional image approximately 2 to 3 seconds before the image appears on the screen. The effect is small but statistically significant, and it has been replicated by multiple independent laboratories. If the presentiment effect is genuine, it provides a specific, measurable physiological mechanism for déjà vu. The body's quantum systems are detecting retrocausal signals from the immediate future and producing physiological responses that the conscious mind interprets as a sense of familiarity, a sense of knowing what will happen next, and a sense that the current moment has already been experienced. The déjà vu is the conscious perception of the body's retrocausal anticipation, the moment when the presentiment signal becomes strong enough to cross the threshold of conscious awareness and produce the distinctive, unmistakable experience of having lived this moment before. The fourth framework is the Penrose-Hameroff model of quantum consciousness. Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff have proposed that consciousness is a quantum phenomenon, that the specific, subjective, qualitative character of conscious experience is produced by quantum computations performed in the microtubules of neurons. The microtubules are protein structures inside every neuron that serve as the cell's structural scaffold, and that Hameroff has argued also serve as quantum computers, processing information through the superposition of quantum states in the tubulin proteins that compose them. In the Penrose-Hameroff model orchestrated objective reduction, or Orch-OR, the quantum computations in the microtubules are connected to the fundamental structure of spacetime through Penrose's theory of objective reduction. Penrose argues that the collapse of the wave function is not triggered by observation, but by the gravitational self-energy of the superposition reaching a critical threshold. When the superposition involves a mass distribution that differs between the superposed states by more than a Planck-scale amount, the space-time geometry of the two states becomes incompatible, and the superposition collapses, objectively reduces, into one or the other state. The collapse is a quantum gravitational event, a moment at which the quantum state and the space-time geometry interact in a way that produces a specific, definite, conscious experience. The evidence for quantum processes in microtubules has strengthened significantly in recent years. In addition to Craddock's 2022 findings, the physicist Anirban Bandyopadhyay at the National Institute for Materials Science in Japan has demonstrated that microtubules exhibit resonance frequencies in the megahertz to gigahertz range frequencies that are consistent with quantum coherent oscillations. Bandyopadhyay's group has shown that microtubules can transmit information through quantum-like processes, that they exhibit long-range correlations that cannot be explained by classical physics, and that the application of specific electromagnetic frequencies can alter the coherence properties of the microtubule network. The anesthetic connection provides additional evidence. General anesthetics, the drugs that eliminate consciousness during surgery, act on microtubules. They bind to specific sites on the tubulin proteins, altering the microtubule's quantum properties and disrupting the coherence that the Orch-OR model identifies as the substrate of consciousness. The fact that the drugs that eliminate consciousness are the drugs that disrupt microtubule quantum coherence is precisely what the Orch-OR model predicts, and it suggests that the quantum coherence of microtubules is not merely correlated with consciousness but causally involved in its production. The relevance of Orch-OR to déjà vu is specific. In the Orch-OR model, each conscious moment is a quantum gravitational event, a collapse of the microtubule superposition that selects a specific conscious experience from among the quantum possibilities. The collapse is non-local in time. It involves the spacetime geometry, which connects the present moment to the past and the future through the block universe structure. And the collapse is connected to the Planck-scale structure of spacetime, the quantum foam, the fundamental discreteness of space and time at the smallest possible scale. Penrose has speculated that the Planck-scale structure of spacetime may contain information that is accessible to the quantum computations in the microtubules, information about the past, the future, and the structure of the block universe that the microtubules can access through their quantum coherence. If this speculation is correct, then the microtubules have access to a form of temporal information that the classical brain does not. Information about future states of the block universe that the quantum gravitational collapse can, under certain conditions, make available to conscious experience. Hameroff has described the Planck-scale information as a form of proto-consciousness, a fundamental pre-biological, universally distributed information structure that is encoded in the quantum geometry of space-time and that the microtubule quantum computations can access through their coherent oscillations. The proto-consciousness is not personal. It is cosmic, a universal information field that contains the entire history and future of the block universe, encoded in the Planck-scale foam that constitutes the deepest structure of space-time. And the microtubules are the antennas, the biological receivers that can tune into the cosmic information field and translate its content into conscious experience. The concept of the Planck-scale proto-consciousness connects directly to the contemplative tradition's descriptions of a universal consciousness that underlies individual consciousness, the Brahman of Hinduism, the Buddha nature of Buddhism, the divine presence of Christianity and Islam. The proto-consciousness is not identical to these theological concepts, but it occupies the same structural position, a universal, pre-personal, information-rich ground of consciousness from which individual conscious experiences emerge and to which they return. Déjà vu, in the Orch-OR framework, is a moment in which the microtubule quantum computation accesses temporal information from the Planck-scale structure of space-time. The computation produces a conscious experience that contains a trace of a future moment, a quantum gravitational echo of a block universe location that the consciousness has not yet reached in its sequential traversal. The echo produces the sensation of familiarity, the feeling of having already experienced the present moment, and the feeling of precognition that accompanies the déjà vu. The experience is brief and involuntary because the quantum coherence that produces it is fragile and easily disrupted by the thermal noise of the brain. But it is genuine, a real perception of a real temporal structure that the quantum brain can access under conditions of sufficient coherence. The Orch-OR framework connects déjà vu to the quantum Zeno effect that we investigated earlier. The Zeno effect stabilizes quantum states through continuous observation. The microtubule quantum computation requires coherence, the maintenance of the superposition, against the decoherence that the thermal environment produces, and the quality of attention, the focus, the continuity, the depth of the conscious observation may determine the degree of coherence that the microtubules can maintain. The meditator who has trained sustained attention may maintain microtubule coherence for longer periods, accessing deeper temporal information from the Planck-scale structure. The distracted mind, whose attention fragments and fluctuates, may maintain coherence only briefly, accessing only the shallow temporal echoes that produce ordinary déjà vu. This connects to the contemplative tradition's description of heightened temporal perception in advanced practitioners. The Buddhist tradition reports that advanced meditators develop the capacity for pubbe-nivasanussati, the recollection of past lives, through the sustained, deep, non-fluctuating attention of jhana meditation. The Christian mystical tradition reports that contemplatives develop the capacity for prescience, the perception of future events, through the sustained practice of contemplative prayer. The Islamic tradition reports that Sufi masters develop firasat, the capacity for direct, intuitive perception of hidden truths, through the sustained practice of dhikr and muraqabah. In each case, the heightened temporal perception is associated with sustained attention with the kind of focused, continuous, non-fluctuating awareness that the Orch-OR framework predicts would maintain microtubule coherence and thereby enhance the brain's access to temporal information from the Planck-scale structure of spacetime. The connection between attention and temporal perception is supported by the phenomenology of déjà vu itself. Déjà vu is most commonly reported during states of relaxed attention during moments of daydreaming, reverie, or the kind of soft, unfocused awareness that characterizes the transition between activities. It is less commonly reported during states of intense, focused concentration. This pattern is consistent with the Orch-OR framework. The focused attention of intense concentration may constrain the microtubule computation to the present moment, preventing the non-sequential excursions that produce déjà vu. The relaxed attention of daydreaming may allow the microtubule computation to explore a wider range of temporal information, producing the occasional non-sequential access that the conscious mind experiences as déjà vu. The paradox is that the contemplative tradition's sustained attention produces enhanced temporal perception, while the ordinary mind's relaxed attention also produces temporal perception in the form of déjà vu. The resolution may lie in the quality of the attention. The contemplative's sustained attention maintains coherence long enough to produce stable, reliable, detailed, temporal perception. The daydreamer's relaxed attention allows coherence to fluctuate, producing brief, unstable, fragmentary temporal perception, the fleeting, disorienting, detail-poor experience that we call déjà vu. The contemplative perceives the block universe with clarity. The daydreamer catches a glimpse of it through a foggy window. Now we must be honest about the status of these four frameworks. The block universe is established physics. General relativity describes space-time as a four-dimensional block, and the block universe interpretation is one of the standard interpretations of relativistic physics. But the mechanism by which consciousness could access future locations in the block non-sequentially is not established. It is speculative. The many worlds interpretation is one of the leading interpretations of quantum mechanics, endorsed by a significant minority of physicists. But the detection of interbranch interference by a macroscopic system like the brain has not been demonstrated. It is speculative. Retrocausality is a genuine feature of several well-developed interpretations of quantum mechanics, including the two-state vector formalism and the transactional interpretation. But the perception of retrocausal influences by conscious experience has not been demonstrated. It is speculative. And the Orch-OR model is a specific, testable proposal for the quantum basis of consciousness that has received some experimental support. The 2022 discovery of quantum coherence in microtubules by the team of Travis Craddock. but that remains controversial and has not been confirmed as the mechanism of consciousness. It is speculative. Each framework is grounded in established physics. Each makes specific predictions about déjà vu that the standard neuroscience does not. And each provides a mechanism by which déjà vu could be, as the contemplative traditions suggest, a genuine perception rather than a neural glitch. But none has been proven. The evidence is suggestive, the frameworks are plausible, and the convergence between the physics and the phenomenology is striking, but the proof is not yet in hand. What we can say is this: the standard neuroscientific account of déjà vu, the familiarity without recollection model, explains the mechanism, but not the phenomenology. It explains why the brain generates a recognition signal without a matching memory. It does not explain why the recognition is accompanied by a feeling of temporal displacement, a feeling of precognition, and a feeling of having accessed a deeper layer of reality. The quantum frameworks provide specific mechanisms for these phenomenological features, and the contemplative traditions provide the experiential data that the quantum frameworks predict, the reports of advanced practitioners who have developed, through sustained contemplative practice, the capacity for the kind of temporal perception that déjà vu provides in brief, spontaneous, involuntary flashes. The convergence between the four quantum frameworks is itself significant. The block universe says the future already exists. The many worlds interpretation says all possible futures already exist. Retrocausality says the future can influence the present. And Orch-OR says the brain has a quantum mechanism for accessing temporal information. Each framework provides a different piece of the puzzle. Together they describe a picture in which déjà vu is not a malfunction but a faculty for perceiving the temporal structure of reality that the ordinary sequential consciousness normally obscures, that the quantum brain can access under conditions of sufficient coherence, and that the contemplative traditions have been training for millennia through the sustained, focused, non-fluctuating attention that maintains the quantum coherence on which the perception depends. The connection to every previous investigation in this series is now visible. The block universe that we explored in our investigation of time provides the temporal structure. The entanglement that we explored in our investigation of distance provides the non-local correlations. The retrocausality that we explored in our investigation of the future self provides the backward-in-time influence. The quantum consciousness that we explored in our investigation of the first observer provides the mechanism. And the sustained attention that we explored in our investigation of the quantum Zeno effect provides the means by which the mechanism can be enhanced through contemplative practice. In the next stage, we will examine how the contemplative traditions understand déjà vu in detail, not as a glitch, but as a faculty, not as a malfunction, but as a perception, and not as a curiosity of the temporal lobe, but as a window into the nature of time, consciousness, and the relationship between the human mind and the temporal structure of reality. We have now examined déjà vu through two lenses: the neuroscience, which describes the mechanism, the misfiring of the familiarity system, the dissociation of recollection and recognition, the conflict monitoring response of the prefrontal cortex, and the quantum physics, which offers four frameworks for understanding the features that the neuroscience cannot explain: the block universe, the many worlds interpretation, retrocausality, and the Orch-OR model of quantum consciousness. The neuroscience says déjà vu is a glitch. The quantum physics says it might be a glimpse. Now we must examine what the contemplative traditions say. Because the traditions have been investigating déjà vu and the broader phenomenon of non-ordinary temporal perception for far longer than either neuroscience or quantum physics has existed, and their conclusions are unanimous. Déjà vu is not a malfunction. It is a faculty. It is not a glitch in the memory system. It is a glimpse of a temporal reality that the ordinary waking mind does not normally perceive, and the traditions do not merely describe this faculty. They provide specific, practice-based, community-tested methods for developing it, methods that transform the brief, involuntary, disorienting flash of déjà vu into a sustained, voluntary, clear perception of the deeper temporal structure of reality. We will begin with Buddhism, which provides the most systematic and the most philosophically rigorous account of non-ordinary temporal perception. The Buddhist tradition identifies three vidyas, three higher knowledges that the Buddha attained on the night of his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. The first is pubbe-nivasanussati, the recollection of past lives. The second is kutupapadhanana, the knowledge of the arising and passing away of beings according to their karma. And the third is asavakkhaya-gnana, the knowledge of the destruction of the mental fermentations that bind consciousness to the cycle of rebirth. The first two are directly relevant to our investigation of déjà vu. Pubbe-nivasanussati is described in the Pali Canon in extraordinary detail. The Buddha reports that on the night of his enlightenment, he recalled not one but many previous lives. 1 birth, 2 births, 3 births, 4, 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, 1,000, 100,000, many eons of world contraction, many eons of world expansion. The recollection was not vague or impressionistic. It was specific. There I had such a name, belonged to such a clan, had such an appearance, such was my food, such my experience of pleasure and pain, such the end of my life. Passing away from that state, I re-arose there. The recollection included names, places, experiences, sensory details, and the specific karmic connections that linked one life to the next. This is not déjà vu in the ordinary sense. It is déjà vu expanded to its fullest extent, the brief involuntary flash of recognition transformed into a sustained, voluntary, detailed recollection of experiences that extend across multiple lifetimes. The ordinary déjà vu experiencer catches a momentary glimpse of temporal information from beyond the present moment, and cannot hold it, cannot identify its source, and cannot repeat the experience at will. The Buddha's pubbe-nivasanussati is the same faculty, developed to its maximum capacity through the systematic training of samadhi, the deep, sustained, one-pointed concentration that the Buddhist meditation tradition cultivates. The mechanism by which samadhi develops pubbe-nivasanussati is described in the Visuddhimagga, the Path of Purification, the 5th century meditation manual written by Buddhaghosa that remains the definitive guide to Buddhist meditation practice. Buddhaghosa describes the process in stages. First, the meditator develops access concentration, the ability to sustain attention on a single object without wavering. Then, the meditator enters the jhanas, the progressive stages of deep absorption in which the mind becomes increasingly unified, increasingly still, and increasingly free from the sensory and cognitive noise that normally obscures subtler forms of perception. In the 4th jhana, the stage of equanimous, one-pointed, perfectly balanced awareness, the mind has been purified of the distortions that prevent non-ordinary temporal perception, and the faculty of pubbe-nivasanussati becomes available. The training is not casual. The Visuddhimagga describes years, sometimes decades, of sustained practice before the faculty of pubbe-nivasanussati becomes reliably available. The practitioner must first master the ethical precepts, the sila, that eliminates the gross disturbances of the mind. Then they must develop the concentration, the samadhi, that eliminates the subtle disturbances. And only then, in the purified, concentrated, deeply still mind of the 4th jhana, does the faculty emerge, not as a supernatural power imposed from outside, but as a natural capacity of the mind that was always present, but that the noise and disturbance of the untrained mind had concealed. The modern Theravada teacher Pa-Auk Sayadaw, one of the few living teachers who systematically teaches pubbe-nivasanussati, reports that meditators who achieve the fourth jhana and direct their attention toward past experiences can, with practice, access memories from before their current birth. The memories are not hallucinations. They are specific, detailed, and sometimes verifiable, containing names, places, and events that the meditator had no normal access to. Pa-Auk Sayadaw does not claim that every meditator achieves this faculty. He claims that the faculty is available to any meditator who develops sufficient samadhi, and that the faculty, when it arises, provides direct, experiential confirmation that consciousness extends beyond the boundaries of a single lifetime. The connection to the Orch-OR framework is direct. The jhanas are states of progressively deepening mental coherence states in which the neural noise decreases, the attentional fluctuations cease, and the brain's quantum systems achieve a degree of coherence that the ordinary waking mind cannot sustain. In the Orch-OR framework, this enhanced coherence would allow the microtubule quantum computations to access deeper levels of temporal information from the Planck-scale structure of spacetime information that the ordinary mind, with its fragmented attention and thermal noise, cannot access. The jhanas are the technology for maintaining the quantum coherence that déjà vu briefly and involuntarily achieves. The second vijja, kutupapadhanana, the knowledge of the arising and passing away of beings, extends the temporal perception from the past into the future. The Buddha reports seeing beings dying and being reborn, passing from one existence to the next according to their karma, with a clarity and a comprehensiveness that includes the past, the present, and the future trajectories of every being he observes. This is the Buddhist equivalent of perceiving the block universe, seeing the complete temporal trajectory of conscious beings, not merely the present moment, but the past that led to it, and the future that will follow from it. The Abhidharma's analysis of time perception provides the theoretical framework for understanding how the jhanas produce non-ordinary temporal perception. The Abhidharma identifies citta, the momentary unit of consciousness, as the fundamental unit of temporal experience. Each citta arises and passes away in a single kazana, a single irreducible moment of consciousness. The ordinary mind experiences these cittas sequentially, one after another, producing the familiar experience of time flowing from past to future. But the jhana mind, purified of the distortions that constrain ordinary perception, can perceive the cittas non-sequentially, accessing past cittas, future cittas, and cittas from other life streams, with the same clarity that the ordinary mind perceives the present citta. The Yogacara school adds the mechanism of the alaya vijnana, the storehouse consciousness that we have encountered throughout this series. The alaya vijnana contains the seeds of all past experiences, all past lives, and all karmic impressions that have accumulated over countless lifetimes. In ordinary consciousness, the seeds are dormant, stored but not accessed, present but not perceived. In the jhana consciousness, the seeds are activated, brought to the surface by the purified attention of the concentrated mind, producing the specific, detailed, experientially vivid recollections that pubbe-nivasanussati describes. Déjà vu in this framework is the spontaneous, involuntary, partial activation of a seed in the alaya vijnana, a moment in which a dormant impression from a past experience briefly surfaces, producing the flash of recognition that the conscious mind cannot identify or explain. The Zen tradition approaches the temporal dimension of consciousness from a different angle. The Zen master Dogen's concept of uji being time, which we have encountered in previous investigations, describes each moment as containing the entirety of time. The present moment is not a thin slice between the past and the future. It is the whole of time, experienced from a specific perspective. When the Zen practitioner perceives Uji directly when the meditation achieves the depth of Kensho, the initial breakthrough into the nature of reality, they perceive that every moment contains every other moment, that the past is present in the present, that the future is present in the present, and that the temporal boundaries that the ordinary mind imposes are constructions that the awakened mind sees through. Déjà vu, in Dogen's framework, is a momentary, involuntary kensho, a flash of being-time perception, in which the ordinary temporal boundaries briefly dissolve and the present moment reveals its hidden content, the past moments that are folded into it, and the future moments that are already present in it. The déjà vu experiencer is not remembering the past or predicting the future. They are perceiving the present, perceiving it deeply enough to see the past and the future that the present moment contains. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition provides an additional framework through the concept of the bardo, the intermediate state between death and rebirth. The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes the bardo as a state of heightened consciousness in which the soul perceives the temporal structure of reality with extraordinary clarity, seeing past lives, future possibilities, and the karmic connections that link them. The bardo consciousness is, in effect, a consciousness that has been freed from the sequential constraints of embodied perception and that can perceive the block universe directly without the temporal filtering that the living brain imposes. The Tibetan practice of dream yoga, the systematic cultivation of lucid awareness within the dream state, is specifically designed to develop the non-ordinary temporal perception that déjà vu provides in brief. Flashes. The dream yogi learns to maintain conscious awareness during dreams, to recognize the dream as a dream while dreaming, and to use the dream state as a platform for exploring dimensions of consciousness that the waking state does not normally access, including the temporal dimensions. The dream yogi who has mastered the practice can, according to the tradition, perceive future events during dreams with a clarity and a specificity that the ordinary dreamer cannot achieve. This connects directly to the phenomenon of déjà rêvé, the recognition that the current moment matches a specific dream. The Tibetan tradition would say that the déjà rêvé experiencer is a spontaneous, untrained dream. Yogi, a person whose dream consciousness briefly accessed the future, encoded the access as a dream, and then recognized the dream when the future moment arrived in waking experience. The trained dream yogi does this deliberately, regularly, and with increasing precision. The untrained person does it spontaneously, rarely, and with the fragmentary, disorienting quality that characterizes ordinary déjà vu. In Christianity, the tradition of prophetic and mystical temporal perception is extensive, well documented, and theologically integrated into the broader understanding of the relationship between the human soul and divine knowledge. The Christian tradition distinguishes between two forms of temporal knowledge: natural knowledge and supernatural knowledge. Natural knowledge is the knowledge that the soul acquires through the senses, through reason, and through the normal operations of the memory and the intellect. Supernatural knowledge is the knowledge that the soul receives through divine grace, knowledge that transcends the capacities of the natural faculties, and that includes, among other things, the knowledge of events that have not yet occurred. The prophetic tradition of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament is the most prominent expression of supernatural temporal knowledge. The prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel received knowledge of future events through divine revelation. The knowledge was specific, detailed, and often verifiable. The fall of kingdoms, the destruction of cities, the coming of the Messiah. The prophetic knowledge was not déjà vu in the ordinary sense. It was the fully developed, divinely granted version of the temporal perception that déjà vu provides in brief, involuntary, fragmentary flashes. The Christian mystical tradition describes a more subtle form of temporal perception that is closer to the phenomenology of déjà vu. The The Desert Fathers, the 4th century monks who withdrew to the Egyptian desert to pursue the contemplative life, reported experiences of spiritual foreknowledge that arose spontaneously during deep prayer. The foreknowledge was not a prophetic revelation in the grand sense. It was a quiet, intimate, experientially specific awareness that a particular event would occur, a visitor would arrive, a letter would come, a specific conversation would take place. The awareness came without warning, without effort, and without the dramatic accompaniments of prophetic vision. It simply appeared in the consciousness of the monk, as naturally and as unobtrusively as a memory. The hagiographic literature of Christianity is filled with specific, documented instances of temporal foreknowledge by saints and mystics. Saint Padre Pio, the 20th century Capuchin friar, was documented by multiple witnesses as predicting specific future events, visitors who would arrive, illnesses that would occur, events that would unfold with a specificity that cannot be attributed to coincidence or to cold reading. Saint John of Kronstadt, the 19th century Russian Orthodox priest, was reported by his contemporaries as frequently knowing the contents of letters before they were opened and the circumstances of visitors before they spoke. These reports are, of course, anecdotal. They do not constitute scientific evidence. They are subject to the biases of hagiographic literature, which is designed to glorify the saint rather than to provide objective documentation. But the consistency of the reports across different centuries, different cultures, and different branches of Christianity suggests that the phenomenon they describe is genuine, that certain contemplatives, through sustained practice, develop a capacity for temporal perception that the ordinary person possesses only in the brief, involuntary, disorienting form of déjà vu. The theologian Karl Rahner described this form of temporal perception as the mystic's awareness of the temporal depth of the present moment. Rahner argued that the mystic, through the sustained practice of contemplative prayer, develops a sensitivity to the divine logos that structures reality, the rational order that connects the past, the present, and the future in a single, coherent, divinely sustained pattern. The mystic perceives this pattern directly, not through reason, not through the senses, but through the spiritual faculty that the contemplative tradition calls the eye of the heart or the inner eye. And the perception of the pattern includes, naturally and without any special effort, the perception of future events that are already present in the pattern, already determined by the divine order, and already available to the consciousness that has learned to perceive the pattern clearly. The Orthodox Christian tradition's concept of the nous, the spiritual intellect, the faculty of direct, non-discursive, contemplative perception is the specific faculty through which temporal perception occurs. The nous is not the rational mind. It is a deeper, more fundamental cognitive faculty that the rational mind normally obscures. The Greek fathers Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Evagrius, Maximus the Confessor described the nous as the faculty by which the soul perceives divine reality directly, without the mediation of concepts, images, or sensory data. The nous perceives the logos, the rational order of the universe, including its temporal order, and the perception of the temporal order includes the perception of past and future events that are present in the logos, but that are hidden from the rational mind. The practice that develops the nous is hesychasm, the prayer of inner stillness. The contemplative practice of the Eastern Orthodox tradition. Hesychasm involves the repetition of the Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. Synchronized with the breath, sustained for hours, practiced daily over years and decades, the practice progressively stills the rational mind, the emotional fluctuations, and the sensory distractions that normally occupy consciousness, allowing the nous to emerge from beneath the noise and to perceive the divine reality that the noise concealed. and the perception includes, as one of its natural consequences, the perception of the temporal depth of the present moment, the awareness that the present moment is not a thin, isolated, temporally bounded instant, but a deep, temporally rich, divinely sustained node in the eternal logos that contains the past, the present, and the future in a single, coherent, directly perceivable pattern. The Philokalia, the collection of texts on the contemplative life compiled by Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain and Macarios of Corinth in the 18th century, describes the nous as a faculty that is present in every human being, but that is normally buried beneath layers of distraction, attachment, and cognitive noise. The Philokalia's authors consistently describe the development of the nous as a process of uncovering, rather than creating, of removing the obstacles that prevent the nous from perceiving what it is naturally equipped to perceive. The obstacles are the passions, the habitual emotional reactions, the compulsive thought patterns, and the attachment to sensory stimulation that keep the nous occupied with the surface of reality and prevent it from perceiving the depths. The hesychast who has cleared the passions and stilled the mind perceives through the nous with a directness and an immediacy that the passion-clouded mind cannot achieve. The temporal perception is one aspect of this direct perception, one dimension of the deeper reality that the nous is equipped to perceive, but that the untrained mind cannot access. The hesychast does not develop a new faculty. They uncover a faculty that was always there, the same faculty that produces déjà vu in the ordinary person, operating at a level of clarity that the ordinary person achieves only in brief, involuntary flashes. Déjà vu, in the Christian framework, is a spontaneous, involuntary activation of the nous, a moment in which the spiritual intellect briefly perceives the temporal depth of the present moment without the sustained practice that would make the perception stable, clear, and voluntary. The ordinary person catches a flash of what the hesychast perceives continuously, the temporal pattern of the logos, the divine order that connects all moments, the presence of the future in the present and the past in the future. The flash is disorienting because it contradicts the ordinary mind's assumption that the present moment is isolated from the past and the future. But the flash is genuine, a real perception of a real temporal structure that the nous is capable of perceiving, and that the contemplative practice is designed to make accessible. In Islam, the concept of kashf unveiling, the removal of the veil that conceals the divine reality from ordinary perception, provides the framework for understanding non-ordinary temporal perception. The Sufi tradition describes kashf as the culmination of the spiritual path, the state in which the veils of ordinary consciousness are removed, and the mystic perceives the divine reality directly, without the mediation of the senses, the intellect, or the imagination. Kashf includes the perception of gaib, the unseen, the hidden dimension of reality that includes the future, the angelic realm, and the divine attributes. The Sufi who attains kashf does not merely believe that the unseen exists. They perceive it directly, experientially, with the same immediacy and the same certainty that the ordinary person perceives the visible world. The Prophet Muhammad described the capacity for perceiving the unseen in the hadith of Firasat. Beware the Firasat of the believer, for indeed he sees with the light of God. The Firasat is not psychic ability in the popular sense. It is a spiritual faculty, a capacity for perception that is grounded in the relationship between the believer's consciousness and the divine light that illuminates all things, including the things that have not yet occurred. The believer who cultivates taqwa, God consciousness, the sustained awareness of the divine presence, develops a sensitivity to the divine light that includes sensitivity to the temporal information that the light contains. The Sufi master, Ibn Arabi, developed the most comprehensive account of temporal perception in the Islamic tradition. Ibn Arabi described time as a series of divine self-disclosures to Jaliyat, in which God reveals himself to creation at each moment through a specific configuration of the divine names. Each moment is a unique self-disclosure containing a unique combination of divine attributes. And the Sufi who has attained kashf can perceive not only the current self-disclosure, but the sequence of self-disclosures that constitutes the past and the future perceiving. In the present moment, the divine pattern that connects all moments and that makes the future knowable to the consciousness that perceives the pattern. Déjà vu, in Ibn Arabi's framework, is a momentary, involuntary kashf, a brief lifting of the veil in which the ordinary consciousness perceives, however faintly and however briefly, the sequence of divine self-disclosures that constitutes the temporal structure of reality. The recognition that déjà vu produces the feeling that this moment has already been experienced is the perception that this self-disclosure has already been contained as a potentiality in the sequence of self-disclosures that preceded it. The future moment was already present in the divine pattern. The déjà vu is the moment when the pattern briefly becomes visible. The concept of ilm al-laduni, divinely bestowed knowledge, the knowledge that comes directly from God without the mediation of study, reason, or sensory experience, is described in the Quran in the story of Khidr, the mysterious figure who guides Moses through a series of events whose purpose is hidden from ordinary perception. Khidr possesses ilm al-laduni, he knows the future consequences of present events, he perceives the hidden meaning of apparent misfortunes, and he acts on the basis of knowledge that Moses, relying on ordinary reason, cannot access. The story of Khidr is the Quran's demonstration that knowledge exists beyond the reach of ordinary perception, knowledge that includes temporal knowledge, knowledge of the future, knowledge of the hidden connections between events, and that this knowledge is available to the consciousness that has been granted divine access to it. The Sufi tradition's concept of the hal, the spiritual state that arises spontaneously during the practice of dhikr and that transforms the practitioner's perception of reality, provides the specific mechanism for the déjà vu experience. The hal is not a permanent station. It is a temporary state, a moment of heightened perception that comes and goes, that cannot be produced by effort alone, and that is experienced by the practitioner as a gift of divine grace. The hal can include temporal perception, the sudden, unbidden awareness of a future event, the recognition of a pattern that connects the present to the future, the flash of kashf that reveals the temporal depth of the present moment. The hal is the Sufi equivalent of the spontaneous déjà vu, a moment of involuntary heightened perception that the sustained practice of dhikr makes increasingly frequent and increasingly clear. Al-Ghazali, in his revival of the religious sciences, described the soul's capacity for temporal perception as analogous to a mirror. The pure soul, the soul that has been cleansed of the attachments, the distractions, and the ego identifications that normally cloud it, reflects the divine reality with clarity, including the temporal dimension of the divine reality. The impure soul reflects the divine reality dimly, distortedly, and intermittently. Déjà vu is the impure soul's intermittent, distorted, fragmentary reflection of the temporal dimension, the flash of temporal clarity that the unpolished mirror produces before the distortions reassert themselves. The Sufi practice of tazkiyat al-nafs, the purification of the soul, through dhikr, through prayer, through ethical discipline, and through the guidance of a spiritual master, is the polishing of the mirror that transforms the intermittent flash into a sustained, clear, undistorted reflection. In Hinduism, the framework of samskaras and the chitta provides the most explicit mechanism for déjà vu as a genuine memory from beyond the present life. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali describe the chitta, the storehouse of consciousness, as containing the impressions of all past experiences from this life and from all previous lives. The samskaras, the impressions, are not passive records. They are active tendencies that shape perception, behavior, and experience. A samskara from a past life can surface in the present life when the conditions of the present moment match the conditions under which the samskara was formed. The surfacing is experienced as a sudden, unexpected, contextless recognition, a feeling that the current moment has been experienced before, without any specific memory that can account for the feeling. This is déjà vu, the surfacing of a samskara from a past experience, possibly a past life, triggered by the resonance between the current conditions and the conditions under which the impression was formed. Patanjali's Yoga Sutra 4.9 states, "Because memory and samskaras are of the same form, there is a causal connection even among births that are separated by species, place, and time." The sutra explicitly asserts that samskaras connect experiences across different lives, different species, different places, and different times. The connection is causal, not merely correlational, but actively producing effects across the temporal gaps between lives. And déjà vu is the experiential manifestation of this causal connection, the moment when a samskara from a past life exerts its causal influence on the present moment, producing the recognition, the familiarity, and the sense of temporal displacement that the déjà vu experiencer reports. The practice of samyama, the combined practice of dharana, dhyana, and samadhi applied to a specific object of meditation, can be directed toward the samskaras themselves. Patanjali's Yoga Sutra 3.18 states, "By direct perception of the samskaras, knowledge of previous births, the meditator who achieves samyama on the samskaras gains direct, voluntary, detailed access to the memories they contain, including memories from previous lives. The practice transforms the involuntary, fragmentary, disorienting flash of déjà vu into a voluntary, comprehensive, clear recollection of past life experiences. The faculty is the same. The degree of development is different. The Bhagavad Gita provides the theological context. Krishna tells Arjuna, 'Many births have you and I passed through, O Arjuna. I remember them all, but you do not.' The divine consciousness remembers all lives. The human consciousness, clouded by avidya ignorance, the fundamental misperception that obscures the true nature of reality, does not. But the clouding is not permanent. It can be removed through the practice of yoga, through the cultivation of viveka, discriminative awareness, and through the grace of the divine. And déjà vu is the moment when the cloud thins enough for a ray of temporal memory to penetrate the moment, when the divine consciousness that remembers all lives sends a flash of recognition through the veil of avidya to the human consciousness that has forgotten. The convergence across the four traditions is now complete. Buddhism says, déjà vu is the spontaneous activation of the pubbe-nivasanussati faculty, which can be developed to full capacity through the jhanas. Christianity says, déjà vu is the spontaneous perception of the nous, which can be developed through hesychastic prayer. Islam says, déjà vu is a momentary kashf, which can be sustained through the purification of the soul. Hinduism says, déjà vu is the surfacing of a samskara, which can be accessed voluntarily through samyama. The traditions agree on the structure. Déjà vu is a natural faculty of consciousness that perceives temporal information beyond the present moment. The faculty is normally dormant, obscured by the noise and distortion of the untrained mind. It can be activated spontaneously, producing the brief, involuntary, disorienting experience that everyone recognizes. And it can be developed systematically through specific contemplative practices into a sustained, voluntary, clear perception of the temporal structure of reality. The traditions also agree on the mechanism of development, sustained attention. The jhanas require sustained attention. Hesychasm requires sustained attention. Vika requires sustained attention. Samyama requires sustained attention. The faculty of temporal perception is developed by the same practice that every investigation in this series has identified as the most fundamental capacity of consciousness, the ability to sustain focused, non-fluctuating, present moment awareness over extended periods. In the final stage, we will bring everything together, the neuroscience, the quantum physics, and the contemplative traditions, and ask what déjà vu reveals about the nature of time, consciousness, and the human mind's relationship to the temporal structure of reality. Because déjà vu is not a trivial experience. It is not a curiosity of the temporal lobe. It is a crack in the wall of ordinary consciousness through which a deeper temporal reality briefly becomes visible. And the question of what lies on the other side of the crack and whether the crack can be widened, stabilized, and transformed into a door is the question that this investigation will answer. We have now examined déjà vu through every available lens. The neuroscience has described the mechanism, the dissociation of familiarity and recollection, the conflict monitoring response of the prefrontal cortex, the Gestalt pattern matching of the perirhinal cortex. The quantum physics has offered 4 frameworks: the block universe, the many worlds interpretation, retrocausality, and the Orch-OR model of quantum consciousness. And the contemplative traditions have described déjà vu as a natural faculty of consciousness, a brief involuntary glimpse of a temporal reality that sustained contemplative practice can develop into a clear, voluntary, reliable perception. Now we must bring everything together and ask what déjà vu reveals about the nature of time, the nature of consciousness, and the nature of the relationship between the human mind and the temporal structure of reality. Let us begin with what déjà vu reveals about time. The ordinary experience of time is sequential. One moment follows another. The past is gone. The future has not arrived, and the present is the thin, moving boundary between the two. The only moment that is real, the only moment that exists. This is the picture of time that common sense provides, that the neuroscience assumes, and that the everyday experience of living in a body, embedded in a world of causes and effects, constantly reinforces. Déjà vu contradicts this picture. The déjà vu experiencer perceives the present moment as having already occurred. The present is not merely present. It is also past a repetition, a re-experiencing, a second encounter with a moment that the experiencer has already lived. And the feeling of precognition that accompanies the experience suggests that the present also contains the future, that the experiencer has access, however briefly and however imprecisely, to what will happen next. If déjà vu is a glitch, a misfiring of the familiarity system, as the neuroscience proposes, then the contradiction is illusory. The present moment has not already occurred. The brain has merely generated a false signal of familiarity that the conscious mind misinterprets as temporal repetition. The experience is misleading. The sequential picture of time is correct, and the feeling that the present moment has been lived before is an error, a neural artifact with no significance for our understanding of the nature of time. But if déjà vu is a glimpse, a brief, involuntary perception of a deeper temporal reality, as the quantum frameworks and the contemplative traditions propose, then the contradiction is informative. It is telling us something true about the nature of time that the sequential picture conceals. It is telling us that the present moment is not the thin, isolated, temporally bounded instant that common sense assumes. It is a deep, temporally rich structure that contains information from the past and the future, that is connected to other moments through quantum correlations, and that can be perceived, under certain conditions, as having a temporal depth that the ordinary sequential consciousness does not normally access. The block universe provides the framework for this temporal depth. In the block, every moment exists simultaneously. The past is real, the future is real, and the present is a perspective, a location in the block from which the block is experienced. Déjà vu is the brief, involuntary perception of the block's simultaneous existence, the moment when the ordinary sequential perspective falters and the block's temporal depth briefly becomes visible. The experiencer perceives, for an instant, that the present moment is not isolated. It is embedded in a temporal structure that extends in both directions toward the past and toward the future, and that the sequential perspective normally conceals. The physicist Carlo Rovelli, in his book The Order of Time, has argued that the experience of sequential time is produced by the thermodynamic properties of the observer, by the fact that the observer interacts with the world through a coarse-grained, entropy-increasing, information-losing process that produces the appearance of temporal flow. The fundamental physics is timeless. The block universe does not flow, and the experience of flow is a feature of the observer's perspective, not of the block itself. Déjà vu is the moment when the observer's perspective briefly shifts, when the coarse graining that normally produces the sequential experience momentarily fails and the timeless structure of the block briefly becomes perceptible. The philosopher Henri Bergson, writing at the turn of the 20th century, proposed a theory of time that anticipates the block universe interpretation of déjà vu with remarkable precision. Bergson argued that the mind operates in two modes: the spatializing mode, which converts time into a sequence of discrete, separate, measurable instants, the mode that clocks measure and that ordinary waking consciousness inhabits, and the intuitive mode, which perceives time as a continuous, indivisible, interpenetrating flow in which the past, the present, and the future are not separate compartments but dimensions of a single, unbroken duration. Bergson called this unbroken duration la durée, and he argued that the spatializing mode distorts the true nature of time by cutting it into artificial segments that the intuitive mode perceives as a seamless whole. Déjà vu, in Bergson's framework, is a momentary eruption of la durée into the spatializing consciousness. The ordinary mind, operating in the spatializing mode, experiences time as a sequence of isolated instants. The déjà vu mind, momentarily operating in the intuitive mode, perceives time as a continuous, interpenetrating whole in which the current instant is not isolated from the past and the future, but suffused with them, containing them, reflecting them, resonating with them. The familiarity is the intuitive mode's perception that the current instant has always been connected to other instants, that the isolation of the present moment from the past and the future is a product of the spatializing mode, not a feature of time itself. Bergson's intuition has been vindicated by the block universe of general relativity. The spatializing mode corresponds to the sequential traversal of the block. The intuitive mode corresponds to the direct perception of the block's simultaneous existence. And déjà vu is the moment when the traversal mode falters and the direct perception briefly takes over. The neuroscientist David Eagleman has proposed a related hypothesis, that déjà vu occurs when the brain's normal timing mechanism briefly malfunctions, causing the current moment to be processed simultaneously through both the familiarity pathway and the recollection pathway, producing the sensation that the current moment is both happening now and being remembered from the, quote, past. Eagleman's hypothesis is neuroscientific, but its structure mirrors Bergson's philosophical insight. The déjà vu is the disruption of the normal temporal processing that produces the sequential experience, and the disruption briefly reveals a non-sequential mode of temporal perception that the normal processing conceals. Now, let us consider what déjà vu reveals about consciousness. The most important implication of déjà vu for consciousness is that consciousness has capacities that ordinary waking experience does not exhaust. The ordinary waking mind perceives time sequentially, space locally, and causation unidirectionally. Déjà vu suggests that these limitations are not fundamental. They are features of a specific mode of consciousness, the ordinary waking mode, that constrains the mind's perception to a narrow band of the total temporal information available. The déjà vu experience demonstrates that the constraints can be temporarily relaxed, that the mind can briefly access temporal information from beyond the present moment, and that the capacity for this access is present in every human being, regardless of training, belief, or intention. This has profound implications for the hard problem of consciousness, the problem of explaining how physical processes in the brain produce the subjective, qualitative, experiential character of conscious experience. The hard problem assumes that consciousness is produced by the brain, that the neural processes are the cause, and the conscious experience is the effect. But déjà vu suggests that consciousness has access to information that the brain's neural processes, operating within the constraints of local, sequential, causal processing, could not provide. If déjà vu is a genuine perception of future events, if the precognition is real, even occasionally, even imprecisely, then consciousness is accessing information from beyond the causal boundary of the brain's present moment neural state. And this access cannot be explained by a model in which consciousness is produced by the brain, because the brain's neural processes do not have access to the future. The philosopher David Chalmers, who formulated the hard problem of consciousness, has acknowledged that the relationship between consciousness and time is one of the deepest unresolved questions in the philosophy of mind. If consciousness is produced by the brain, then consciousness should be limited to the information that the brain's neural processes can access, which, in the standard neuroscientific framework, is limited to the present moment state of the brain's neurons and their immediate history. But déjà vu suggests that consciousness has access to information from beyond this boundary, information that the brain's present moment neural state does not contain, and that the brain's immediate history does not explain. The philosopher Thomas Nagel, in his paper, "What is it like to be a bat?" argued that consciousness has a subjective character, a what it is like quality that cannot be reduced to the physical processes that produce it. Déjà vu adds a temporal dimension to Nagel's argument. There is something it is like to experience déjà vu, something specific, qualitatively distinct, and irreducible to the neural processes that the neuroscience describes. The what it is like of déjà vu includes the feeling of temporal displacement, the feeling of precognition, and the feeling of having accessed a deeper layer of reality. These are not features of the neural mechanism, they are features of the conscious experience. And they suggest that the conscious experience has a temporal dimension, a capacity for temporal perception that the neural mechanism, operating within the constraints of present moment, sequential, local processing, cannot account for. The Orch-OR model provides a resolution. Consciousness is not produced by the brain's classical neural processes. It is produced by quantum processes in the microtubules that are connected to the fundamental structure of spacetime, and that can, through this connection, access temporal information that the classical processes cannot reach. The consciousness is not limited to the brain. It is rooted in the space-time geometry, and the space-time geometry contains the entire block universe, past, present, and future, making temporal information from all moments potentially accessible to the quantum processes that produce conscious experience. The contemplative traditions have always maintained that consciousness is not limited to the brain. Buddhism describes consciousness as a stream that extends across multiple lifetimes, connecting past experiences to present perceptions through the mechanism of the alaya vijnana. Christianity describes the soul as a spiritual entity that participates in the divine logos, the timeless, eternal, all-encompassing, rational order that contains all moments simultaneously. Islam describes the human spirit as a breath from God, a divine emanation that connects the individual consciousness to the cosmic consciousness that pervades all of reality. And Hinduism describes the Atman as identical to Brahman, the individual consciousness, as a localized expression of the universal consciousness that exists beyond the boundaries of time and space. The convergence between the quantum physics and the contemplative traditions on the nature of consciousness is remarkable. Both describe consciousness as extending beyond the brain. The physics describes the extension through the quantum coherence of microtubules connected to the Planck-scale structure of spacetime. The traditions describe the extension through the soul's participation in the divine order, the Atman's identity with Brahman, the Alaya Vijnana's storage of information from multiple lifetimes. The language is different, the mechanisms are different, but the structure is the same. Consciousness is not confined to the brain. It has access to information from beyond the brain's causal boundary, and déjà vu is the experiential evidence for this access, the moment when the extension becomes briefly conscious. The psychologist Carl Jung described déjà vu in terms that bridge the quantum and the contemplative frameworks. Jung proposed that déjà vu is the activation of an archetype, a pattern in the collective unconscious that connects the individual consciousness to the shared, transpersonal, temporally unbounded field of human experience. The archetype is not a personal memory. It is a collective pattern, a structural similarity between the current moment and the accumulated experience of the species. Jung's collective unconscious occupies the same structural position as the Alaya Vijnana in Buddhism, the Planck-scale proto-consciousness in the Orch-OR model, and the divine logos in Christianity. A deeper, more fundamental level of consciousness that contains temporal information beyond the individual's personal history, and that can surface, briefly and involuntarily, in the experience of déjà vu. Déjà vu is, in this framework, the experiential evidence for the tradition's claims. It is the moment when the ordinary consciousness, the consciousness that identifies itself with the brain, with the body, with the present moment, with the sequential flow of time, briefly perceives its own deeper nature. It perceives that it is not limited to the brain. It is not bounded by the present moment. It is not constrained to the sequential flow. It has access to temporal information that the brain alone could not provide. And the access, however brief and however fragmentary, is a crack in the wall of ordinary consciousness through which the deeper reality briefly becomes visible. The psychologist William James described this in terms that directly anticipate our investigation. Our normal waking consciousness is but one special type of consciousness, whilst all about it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. Déjà vu is the filmiest of screens becoming briefly transparent. It is the potential form of consciousness, the temporal consciousness, the block-perceiving consciousness, the non-sequential consciousness briefly becoming visible through the ordinary waking consciousness that normally conceals it. James's filmiest of screens has acquired, through this investigation, a specific physical interpretation. The screen is decoherence, the thermal noise of the macroscopic environment that destroys the quantum coherence of the brain's microtubules and that prevents the non-sequential temporal perception from becoming stable and sustained. The screen is thin because the coherence is fragile. The screen is filmy because the decoherence is not absolute. The quantum correlations are suppressed but not destroyed, hidden but not eliminated. And the screen becomes transparent, briefly, during déjà vu, because the coherence is momentarily restored by a fluctuation, by a specific neural state, by the relaxed attention of daydreaming, or by the conditions that the contemplative traditions have learned to cultivate deliberately. The neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, whose integrated information theory we have encountered throughout this series, has proposed that consciousness is identical to integrated information phi. The greater the phi, the richer the conscious experience. Déjà vu may represent a moment of elevated phi, a moment in which the brain's integration suddenly increases, producing a richer, deeper, more temporally comprehensive conscious experience than the ordinary waking state provides. The temporal depth of the déjà vu experience, the sense that the present moment contains information from the past and the future, may be the experiential signature of elevated phi, the sign that the brain's integrated information has briefly expanded to include temporal correlations that the ordinary phi does not incorporate. If this is correct, then the contemplative practices that develop temporal perception are practices for increasing phi, for expanding the brain's integrated information to include deeper, broader, more temporally comprehensive correlations. The meditator who develops pubbe-nivasanussati has expanded their phi to include correlations that extend across lifetimes. The hesychast who perceives the temporal depth of the present moment has expanded their phi to include correlations that extend across the block universe. And the ordinary person who experiences déjà vu has, for a moment, expanded their phi just enough to perceive a single temporal correlation that the ordinary phi does not include. Now, let us connect déjà vu to every investigation in this series. In our investigation of time, we establish that the block universe contains all moments simultaneously, and that the experience of temporal flow is produced by consciousness, not by the physics. Déjà vu is the experiential confirmation of the block universe, the moment when the consciousness that normally produces the sequential flow briefly fails to maintain it, and the simultaneous existence of the block becomes perceptible. In our investigation of distance, we establish that space is emergent from entanglement, and that the apparent separation between objects conceals an underlying quantum connection. Déjà vu extends this insight to the temporal dimension. The apparent separation between moments, the gap between the past and the future, that the present moment seems to occupy, conceals an underlying quantum connection between moments that déjà vu briefly reveals. In our investigation of gravity, we establish that the curvature of spacetime is the geometric expression of entanglement. Déjà vu may be the conscious perception of the temporal component of this curvature, the perception that the temporal geometry of spacetime is not flat but curved, connecting moments to each other through the quantum correlations that the flat, sequential picture of ordinary experience conceals. In our investigation of death and grief, we establish that the information constituting a human being is not destroyed at death, but preserved in the quantum state of the universe. Déjà vu connects to this through the phenomenon of déjà visité, the spatial familiarity with places one has never visited. If the quantum information from a previous life is preserved in the entanglement structure of the universe, then the déjà visité may be the recognition of a place that the quantum information has encoded, a place from a previous existence that the current consciousness recognizes through the quantum correlations that connect it to its own past information. In our investigation of dreams and quantum timelines, we explored the possibility that dreams provide access to quantum information from other branches of the wave function. Déjà rêvé. The recognition that the current moment matches a specific dream is the waking confirmation of this access. The dream accessed the future. The waking experience confirms the access. And the déjà vu is the moment of recognition in which the two, the dream and the waking experience, converge. In our investigation of the future self and retrocausality, we establish that the future can influence the present through quantum mechanical mechanisms. Déjà vu is the conscious perception of this retrocausal influence, the moment when the future moment's backward traveling quantum signal reaches the present consciousness and produces the sensation of recognition that something about this moment has already been determined. In our investigation of evolution, we establish that evolution may be a quantum algorithm computing toward consciousness. Déjà vu is evidence that the consciousness the algorithm has produced has capacities that extend beyond the classical computation of the brain. capacities for quantum-level temporal perception that the evolutionary process has encoded in the microtubule architecture of the neurons. In our investigation of the quantum Zeno effect, we established that continuous observation sustains quantum states and that the quality of attention determines the quality of the observation. Déjà vu connects to this directly. The sustained attention of contemplative practice maintains the quantum coherence that the temporal perception requires. The meditator who sustains focused attention for extended periods is performing the quantum Zeno effect on the microtubule quantum computations, stabilizing the coherence that allows the computations to access temporal information from the Planck-scale structure of spacetime. Ordinary déjà vu is the brief, unstabilized flash that occurs when coherence is momentarily achieved without sustained attention. The contemplative's temporal perception is the stabilized, sustained version that occurs when the Zeno effect maintains the coherence over extended periods. In our investigation of the acceleration of time, we established that the subjective rate of time is determined by the information processing capacity of the conscious system, and that the degradation of attention produces the acceleration of subjective time. Déjà vu is the temporal counterpart of this acceleration. The acceleration is the loss of temporal resolution caused by reduced attention, and déjà vu is the brief recovery of temporal depth caused by a momentary spike in attentional quality. The two phenomena are inverse expressions of the same underlying principle. The quality of attention determines the quality of temporal experience, and déjà vu is the moment when the quality briefly exceeds the threshold required for non-sequential temporal perception. In our investigation of the inseparable quark, we established that isolation is forbidden at every scale of physical reality. Déjà vu extends this to the temporal dimension. Temporal isolation, the isolation of the present moment from the past and the future, is as much an illusion as spatial isolation. The moments are connected. The present contains the past and the future, and déjà vu is the moment when the temporal connections become briefly visible, just as quantum entanglement is the moment when the spatial connections become experimentally detectable. In our investigation of the principle of least action, we established that the universe follows the optimal path through the landscape of possibility. Déjà vu may be the conscious perception of the optimal path, the moment when consciousness briefly perceives the trajectory of least action that connects the past to the future through the present, recognizing the trajectory as familiar because the optimization has already determined its structure before the consciousness has traversed it. The déjà vu is the consciousness catching a glimpse of the path that the principle of least action has already selected, the path that the universe is already following, and that the consciousness, traversing the path sequentially, occasionally perceives all at once. Every investigation in this series has described a different dimension of a single, unified reality, a reality in which space is emergent, time is a block, consciousness is constitutive, and the boundaries that the ordinary mind perceives between self and other, past and future, matter and mind, are products of decoherence, not features of the fundamental structure. Déjà vu is the experience in which all of these boundaries briefly thin simultaneously, in which the temporal boundary between past and future, the epistemic boundary between memory and perception, and the ontological boundary between the brain and the deeper consciousness all become momentarily transparent, producing the disorienting, exhilarating, profoundly meaningful experience that nearly every human being has had, and that none can fully explain. The philosopher Martin Heidegger described the human being as Dasein, being there, the being that exists in the world by being open to the world, by perceiving the world, by being affected by the world. Déjà vu is a moment of heightened Dasein, a moment of extraordinary openness, in which the ordinary filters that constrain perception are briefly removed, and the temporal world reveals a dimension of itself that the ordinary Dasein, does not perceive. The moment passes, the filters return. The ordinary sequential perception reasserts itself. But the memory of the opening remains the memory that something extraordinary happened, that the world showed a face it does not normally show, that time revealed a depth it does not normally reveal. The picture that emerges from this synthesis is coherent and stunning. Time is a block. All moments exist simultaneously. Consciousness traverses the block sequentially, producing the experience of temporal flow. But the sequential traversal is not the only mode of temporal perception available to consciousness. Under certain conditions that include the momentary achievement of quantum coherence in the brain's microtubules, the relaxed attention of daydreaming, the sustained attention of deep meditation, and the specific neural conditions that produce the familiarity, recollection, dissociation consciousness, can access information from other locations in the block. The access is normally brief, involuntary, and fragmentary, but it can be developed through sustained contemplative practice into a stable, voluntary, detailed perception of the block's temporal structure. Déjà vu is the entry point. It is the spontaneous, untrained, universally available version of a perception that the contemplative traditions have been developing for millennia. Every human being who has experienced déjà vu has experienced, however briefly and however imprecisely, the perception that the mystics describe. The perception that time is not what it appears to be, that the present moment contains information from beyond its sequential boundaries, and that consciousness has capacities that the ordinary waking mind does not exhaust. The neuroscience says the experience is a glitch. The physics says it might be a glimpse. The traditions say it is a faculty. And the convergence of all three investigations suggests that the truth includes elements of all three. Déjà vu involves a genuine neural mechanism. The familiarity, recollection, dissociation may involve a genuine quantum perception, the access to temporal information through microtubule coherence, and points to a genuine capacity of consciousness, the faculty for non-sequential temporal perception that the contemplative traditions have been developing for thousands of years. So what does this mean for you? It means that the ordinary waking consciousness you inhabit every day is not the totality of your mind. It is a mode, a specific, functional, evolutionarily optimized mode that is designed for sequential, local, causal processing of the immediate environment. The mode is extraordinarily useful. It allows you to navigate the physical world, to plan for the future based on the past, to interact with other beings in real time, and to function as a biological organism in a competitive environment. But the mode is not all there is. Behind it, beneath it, within it, there is a deeper consciousness, a consciousness that the block universe describes as temporally unbounded, that the quantum physics describes as connected to the Planck-scale structure of spacetime, and that the contemplative traditions describe as the soul, the Atman, the Buddha nature, the divine spark. Déjà vu is proof that the deeper consciousness exists. Not scientific proof, the evidence is not yet sufficient for that, but experiential proof, the direct first-person, phenomenologically unmistakable evidence that your consciousness has capacities that the ordinary waking mode does not exhaust. Every time you experience déjà vu, you are experiencing evidence that there is more to your mind than the sequential, local, causally constrained processing that the neuroscience describes. You are experiencing evidence that your consciousness can perceive time in a non-sequential way. And you are experiencing evidence that the wall between the ordinary consciousness and the deeper consciousness is not a permanent barrier, but a temporary screen that can be, and occasionally is, penetrated. It means that the next time you experience déjà vu, you should pay attention. Not to the content of the experience, the specific details of the moment that feels familiar, the specific sense of what will happen next. Pay attention to the experience itself, to the quality of consciousness that the experience reveals. Because the experience is showing you something about your own mind that the ordinary waking state normally conceals, that your consciousness is not limited to the present moment, that your perception is not confined to the sequential flow of time, and that somewhere in the architecture of your brain, in the microtubules of your neurons, in the quantum coherence of your neural processes, in the deep structure of the consciousness that you are, there is a faculty that can perceive time in a way that the ordinary mind cannot. The faculty is there. It is present in every human being. It activates spontaneously, producing the déjà vu that everyone has experienced. And it can be developed through the practices that every contemplative tradition has been refining for millennia: the sustained attention of meditation, the deep stillness of contemplative prayer, the rhythmic remembrance of dhikr, the concentrated focus of samyama. The traditions are not asking you to believe in something supernatural. They are asking you to develop something natural, a faculty that you already possess, that you have already experienced, and that the neuroscience, the quantum physics, and the contemplative traditions all converge in describing, from their different perspectives, as a genuine capacity of the human mind. Déjà vu is not a glitch. It is an invitation from your own consciousness, delivered in the only language that consciousness speaks, telling you that there is more to time, more to perception, and more to you than the ordinary waking mind has ever allowed you to see. The wall of ordinary consciousness has a crack. The crack is déjà vu. And on the other side of the crack is the temporal reality that the block universe describes, that the quantum physics makes accessible, and that the contemplative traditions have been exploring since the first human being sat down, closed their eyes, and paid attention to what was really there. The crack is already in your wall. You have felt it. Everyone has. The question is not whether the crack exists. The question is what you will do with it. The traditions say, widen it, stabilize it, transform it from a crack into a door, and walk through, because on the other side of that door is not another world. It is this world, this same moment, this same reality perceived with the fullness, the depth, and the temporal richness that your consciousness was always capable of perceiving, but that the ordinary waking mode, with its sequential constraints and its decoherent filters, had trained you to overlook. Déjà vu is the reminder that the fullness is there, that the depth is there, that the richness is there. It has always been there, and it is waiting for the attention that will widen the crack, stabilize the opening, and transform the momentary glimpse into a sustained perception of the temporal reality that every investigation in this series, from every direction, has been pointing toward. A universe in which every moment contains every other moment, a consciousness that can perceive this containment, and a present that is not a thin, passing instant but an infinite depth waiting to be explored by the mind that has learned, at last, to pay attention to what was always there.